All right, in this lesson, we'll dive into how we can convert numbers to strings and vice versa. Let's begin by creating a variable. I'm going to give it a name of str, just a simple three-letter variable name for string, and I'm going to assign it to a string, so I'm going to have double quotes, but inside I'm going to write a number, like 5. Right? So even though we have the number 5, remember that this is just a character to Ruby. This is a regular one-character string. If I output str to my Atom runner, we can see that it appears here in quotes. It is a string. And what I can do here is introduce that class method that we talked about in the previous lesson. It is available on all objects in Ruby. In the last lesson, we did it on floating point numbers and integers, and we got the float class and the fixed num class. But what I can do here is take str, which again represents a valid string, and use the class method with .class. And we can see that Ruby is going to tell us that this class, this blueprint that forms a string, is called string. So regardless of what my string is, whether it's 1 character or 10 characters, whether it's a name or a phrase, it's always going to come from a class called string. How do I convert this string to an integer or a float? Well, what I can do is take str, which again is the variable that's pointing to that string, and there is a convenient toI method. There is an underscore between those two words, and toI predictably means to integer. It's a method that is available on a string object that converts it to an integer object. So what we can do here is do this, p str to I, and we're going to see 5 output here. Now, by itself, we know that this is successfully converted to an integer, but to prove this to you, what I can actually do is a little bit of method chaining, which means adding another method at the end here. Remember that this is going to give us an integer, and what we can do, since this is a valid Ruby object, is continue calling methods on that object, assuming that that object has the method that we want. And so what we can do here is actually do .class. And what Ruby is going to do is convert this string to an integer, and then we're going to ask that object to execute the class method on it. So if I take a look, we can see that it's going to output fixed num. So this operation has successfully changed the 5 within the quotes, which was a string, to a fixed num or integer object. Now, a key thing to remember here is that the value of str has not actually changed. If I output str right below, we can see that it's still 5 with the double quotes. So this operation is not saved anywhere. It's simply a temporary operation that we do. We take that str variable, we take its object, which is a string, we convert it to an integer, we ask that integer to give us the class, and we output it. But at no point do we save this new result to a new variable or overwrite our old variable. So the original str variable is still pointing to that string of a character of 5. Nothing's changed so far, even though we called this method. So this is not a permanent operation. It doesn't mutate or change the original object that str is pointing to. It's just a temporary change, so we can take a look at the result. There is a convenient toF method as well, to_f, and predictably that's short for toFloat. What that's going to do is convert the number to a float. Perhaps a better example here, we can see that it's going to be 5.0, but if I change this str to something like 5.8, we can see here that it's going to be 5.8. And if I once again do str.toF class, just so we can see the blueprint or the class that forms the underlying object here, we can see that now it's going to be a float. So we've converted it from a string to a fixed num, and then from a string to a float. And again, these operations are temporary. They have not adjusted the original value that str is pointing to. All right, so let's wipe the slate clean. I'm going to remove all the content here. And now let's talk about converting numbers to strings or floats. I'm going to create a variable called number. And let's say I set it equal to 10. I can immediately output the class of the number or the blueprint that formed it. It's a fixed num. And now I can do number, and this time I'm going to call a method called toS. We explored this in the previous section, and toS is short for toString, and it's going to convert this fixed num object into a string object. We can see the quotes appear there on the right around the 10, and if I just add that .class method at the end, and that's possible because a string object does include a class method, just like every other object in Ruby does, we can see that we've taken it from a fixed num to a string. Just like with the toI and toF methods that we explored a few minutes ago, this does not modify the 10 that number is pointing to. It is still an integer. This is still a temporary operation. We can also, of course, take an integer and convert it to a float. So if I do number toF, that's short for toFloat, we can see we're going to get 10.0, and if that's not proof enough, we can just do 2f.class to take a look at the class that forms the underlying object right here that this generates, and we can see that that's going to be a float. So that's how we can convert a number to a string or a float. All right, now let's clear our output again. And now let's dive into the last set of sequence steps, which is converting a floating point number to an integer or a string. So once again, let's say I have a variable called pi. I'm going to set it equal to 3.14. That's the most common floating point number I can think of. So if I do pi, which is my variable, what I can do here is call a method like toI, which is short for toInteger. What this is going to do is take that floating point, but this is going to be a little bit interesting because how is Ruby going to deal with those extra decimal components? Well, what Ruby's going to do is basically just chop them off. It's going to cut it off. And this is regardless of what the decimal component is. So it doesn't round, it simply chops it off. So if I just temporarily change this to something like 3.99, it's not going to round to 4. It's just going to give me 3 again. It's basically going to take this component, everything after the decimal point, just chop it off and return this as the integer result. So I'll return this back to 3.14. We can see here that we're getting 3 as the output of the toI method. What I can do here is once again do py or pi.class and output.class below after I call the toI method as well. And we can see we're taking it from a float to a fixed num. I'm going to remove these 2 lines and then just demonstrate again the toS method, which is also available on a float object. So if I do ppi.toS, that's toString, I'm going to convert it to a string with those characters, and now you can keep in mind that that decimal point in between is now another valid character, so the length of this string is 4 characters, not 3. And similarly, I can do pi2s.class to show you that it is in fact a string, and again, the value in pi is not modified. This is just a temporary operation. All right, to conclude this lesson, I'm going to wipe the slate clean again, and I just want to show you that these 3 methods, toI, toS, and toF, are actually available on objects even if the object is already that data type. In that case, the result will simply be the exact same thing. So if I already have a string like 5, you can see here in quotes, and I call toS, not toI, which converts to an integer, not toF, which converts to a float, but toS, what it's going to do is say, oh, you have a string and you want a string? Well, here it is, just the exact same thing. Predictably, if I do .class, it's just going to tell me it's a string. We're starting from a string, we're getting back a string. Similarly, if I have an integer like 10 and I call toI on it, it's already an integer, so Ruby is just going to give me back another integer. Again, the class for an integer in Ruby is called fixNum. That's just the class or blueprint name for an integer or a whole number. And finally, if I have a floating point like 99.99, and I call a method like toF, if I take a floating point number and I tell Ruby that I want to convert it to a floating point number, Ruby's just going to give it to me backwards or again, and you can see that it's going to be the exact same result. Once again, I'm going to use .class on this float, and it is a class of float. So you can see calling these methods on objects of the same type is simply going to return that object again. So that's a quick introduction to conversion from strings to numbers and floats and vice versa.